Loneliness is the price we have to pay for being born in this modern age, so full of freedom, independence, and our own egotistical selves.
Those sober words are from a novel first published over 100 years ago called Kokoro, a meditation on being human in the modern world. The author has had a profound influence on generations of Japanese writers, artists and musicians, and is considered Japan's greatest novelist of the modern era. His name is Natsume Soseki, and by the time he died in 1916, he'd gained the status of a literary giant in Japan, the flow of his pen no doubt driven in part by the turbulent times he lived through. Born in 1867, just as Japan was beginning to modernize and engage with the West, Soseki used his writing to reflect the existential angst brought about by huge social and economic change. Today, his works are widely taught to Japanese high school students and every line scrutinized by scholars. There's even a manga series devoted to him, and a robotic replica of him tours the country giving lectures. Yet despite his superpower status in Asia, in the English-speaking world, he remains relatively unknown. So today we'll be discussing why. I'm Bridget, Kendall, and on this edition of The Forum from the BBC World Service, we're looking at the life and work of the Japanese writer Natsume Soseki. I'm joined by three guests. Damian Flanagan is a British writer and literary critic. He has a PhD in Japanese literature from Kobe University and is the first Westerner to publish a book in Japanese on Natsume Soseki. Michael Bourdaghs is Professor of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago in the United States. He's also translated some of Soseki's work into English. And Reiko Auestad is Professor of Japan Studies at the University of Oslo in Norway. And Reiko, you actually have a personal link to Soseki via your grandfather, don't you? Can you tell us more about that?
Okay, Soseki was a very familiar figure as I grew up, partly because of the personal connection my grandfather had with Soseki. One of the things that was kind of interesting is that I noticed that my mother, who was very outspoken and lively at home, behaved very differently whenever we were at my grandparents' place. She became extremely subservient in the presence of my grandparents, and she hardly dared to express her opinions. And my father, who was very much under my mother's thumb at home, acted much more authoritarian, even chauvinistic, which surprised and confused my childish mind. But when I think back now, I believe this childhood experience gave me an invaluable insight into the kind of gendered hierarchy that prevailed in the ES system, the family system in Japan at the time, which Soseki writes a lot about.
Well, we'll hear a bit more about the social context in which Soseki wrote and some of these questions about gender and hierarchy a bit later on. But first, let's hear some of the most famous opening lines in Japanese literature.
Going up a mountain track, I fell to thinking. Approach everything rationally, and you become harsh. Pull along in the stream of emotions, and you will be swept away by the current. Give free rein to your desires, and you become uncomfortably confined. It is not a very agreeable place to live, this world of ours.
Well, that's the opening passage to Soseki's 1906 novel, Kusamakura. Reading this novel has been likened to taking a walk. I wonder, Damian, do you agree with that? And if so, can you explain why?
Well, I think that novel is it's one of the gems in Soseki's oeuvre. But the incredible thing about Soseki is he's a little bit like Shakespeare, is he has at least a dozen, perhaps a score of works which are regarded as great classics of Japanese literature. And the wonderful thing about Soseki is that each of those works tend to be radically different from the other ones. Soseki had this fantastically kind of dialectical mind that was always trying to reach new literary places. In that particular work, Kusamakura, he creates this wonderful idea of an artist going up into the mountains to try an artistic experiment, which is to look at the world where you're not involving your emotions in what you're seeing, but you look at things from an emotional distance. So it's a really fascinating idea of how you approach art that's going on in that work. That novel is supposed to be the novel that caught the attention of editors and so impressed them with the depth of Soseki's knowledge and the incredible beauty of his writing, that at the time when he was teaching at Tokyo University and was doing quite an academic position, it convinced people that he could actually also appeal to a mass audience, that he was, on the one hand, this incredible intellectual mind, but also had this fantastic ability, as we see in the opening of that piece, that you can say quite technically difficult things in a beautiful language that can appeal to people. And that novel in particular is one that has transcended Japan and has had influence far outside Japan. For example, the great Canadian pianist Glenn Gould became absolutely fascinated and obsessed with that novel for the last 15 years of his life.
The English title of this novel, The Three-Cornered World, is drawn from this reflection by Soseki.
An artist is a person who lives in the triangle, which remains after the angle which we call common sense has been removed from the four-cornered world.
Michael, that's quite a dense thought, isn't it? Can you explain it for us in the context of the novel?
Yes, I think Damian already mentioned the central philosophical problem in the novel of trying to maintain emotional distance, trying not to find any attachment with the world that one is observing. But I love, a few seconds ago, you quoted the opening passage of the novel. One of my favorite parts of the novel comes a page later when, as the narrator protagonist is walking and having these thoughts, he trips over a rock. And there's a sly sense of humor all through the novel as he tries to maintain this artistic distance and lack of attachment to the world that he's seeing, and yet constantly finds himself tripping over rocks in it and confronting reality, even as he tries to distance himself from it.
And why do you think it's such an important artistic achievement, this novel?
It's Soseki called it his haiku novel. He was deliberately experimenting with trying to write a different kind of novel from the sorts of novels that were being published. And it is not a plot-driven work. There's very little that happens in the plot. It is mostly a stream of consciousness form of narration as we live in the mind of this city dweller who's come out into a rural area, determined to be completely detached and determined to produce a work of art while he's there. It's full of wonderful allusions to classical Chinese literature, to classical Japanese literature, to European literature. It layers all of these traditions together in a really unique combination that I find absolutely fascinating. It's the first work of Soseki's that I ever encountered when I was about 21 or 22. And when I started reading it, I read it through literally in one sitting and couldn't put it down. And as soon as I finished it, I had to start reading it again because I'd never read a novel, anything like this.
There is this theme of tragic displacement, isn't there, running not only through Soseki's work, but also his life. As I said, he was born in 1867 in the city of Edo, the year before it was renamed Tokyo. And Reiko, can you give us a sense of some of the ways in which Japan was transforming at that time?
Well, I think what makes Soseki interesting, many of the characters, the struggles that many of his characters are going through in his novels interesting is that it's kind of symptomatic of the kind of the changes, great changes that were going on in the Meiji period. The kind of sort of sexual morals were changing, and the Confucianistic moral values that were prevalent in the Edo period. And there was a sort of a gap in the ways in which people were catching on to these changes.
So can you explain about what the Confucian morals were and how those changes, what that meant, what the tensions were?
Well, I think the tension was typically expressed maybe in a novel like Kokoro, that the Confucian sort of value system where like friendship to your male friend, the homosocial world in which sort of male bonding, male friendship was very much valued, and the women were in the background. And when the ideology of love in marriage was imported from Europe, the principle was sort of behind the heterosexual love marriage and premised on more gender equality. That was very new and revolutionary. And in the minds of someone like Soseki, who grew up in a very Confucian environment as a child, who later had a very modern Western education and read a lot of European literature in which like the heterosexual love marriage was extremely important. And there was sort of this gap between your loyalty to your sort of the old homosocial world, where the women were kind of pushed into the background, and this more sort of heterosocial world in which women and men and women equally participate in the social life.
Michael, can I put that question to you too? Can you give us a sense of some of the ways in which Japan was transforming at the time? I'm thinking about the social and economic changes too.
Well, there was a massive transformation of society at really all levels, from the education system, which the new government that took over in 1868 instituted mandatory primary education, to the military system, to the government system, to the economy. One of the most drastic changes was a change of the taxation system. Taxes had previously been paid in kind, a percentage of rice crop. It was switched to a taxation system that was based on the value of land paid in cash. In 1890, a new constitution was introduced that introduced limited voting privileges to the population. So Soseki lived through these dramatic changes in the society. And as Reiko has suggested, we can see in his own life him really going from one world to another world. His first education, really into his teenage years, he received the same sort of education in classical Chinese culture that anyone in Japan who was being educated in the 1800s or early 1900s would receive. But then by the time he reaches his 20s, he's in a modern university system studying subjects like English literature, psychology, sociology, philosophy. So he really was born in one world, halfway raised in that world, and then switched gears and pursued his adult life in another world, but always able to call on those memories of a very different kind of society with a very different set of values and a very different set of everyday practices.
He also had a very disrupted childhood, didn't he? Michael, can you tell us more about that, about his upbringing?
Yes, his own story is so dramatic that we're always, when we read his works, we're always looking for traces of his own childhood experiences. His parents were very old when he was born, and he had, I think, 4 older brothers, and he was sort of an embarrassment to have a child at that age. And so they sent him out for adoption, which was quite common at the time when he was a baby. But his sister went to his adopted family, walked by and saw the baby set outside their house with nobody minding it, and got so offended that she brought him back home because she didn't think the adopted family was taking care of him. So he came back home at that point and then was sent out for adoption again, and was actually raised by another family into his he did his primary schooling as the son of another family, but then that family's marriage broke up, and some of Soseki's older brothers died of illness, and his birth family started worrying whether he would have an heir, a male son around to take over the family line. And so he was called back to his original birth family. So his childhood was full of instabilities. He never could really be certain what home was, where it was that he belonged. And if you look at his works, his first major work, I Am a Cat, is about a stray cat that wanders into a house and isn't sure if it really belongs there. We see this kind of figure repeated over and over again in his fiction.
Yes, it was apparently a family maid who revealed to the young Soseki the secret of his true parentage. It seems she'd overheard his parents discussing how to break the news to him and acted on sympathetic impulse. This was Soseki's account of how he reacted to this revelation.
I said only that I would keep this a secret as she bid me to. But in my heart I was very happy. It wasn't that she had told me the truth. My happiness was due merely to the fact that the maid had been kind to me. Curiously, given how grateful I felt, I can no longer remember her name or face. All I remember is her kindness.
Poignant words from his memoir. What do you make of them, Damian? How do you think that experience affected him?
Well, I think that Soseki is, from his family background, he's been destabilized psychologically, which creates a constant quest of trying to ponder your own identity. But he's also placed in a historical epoch in which Japan itself is suffering this crisis of identity. It's gone from a very superficially stable system that's been closed off from the rest of the world for 250 years. And then it's thrown into this complete maelstrom of massive change in an incredibly short period of time, where Japan's really coming to terms with exactly what we are. The whole country was engaged on a project essentially of trying to catch up with Western imperial powers, which were sort of lurking around Japan. And this not only creates a sort of identity crisis, but it also means that for the brightest and the best in Japan, of which Soseki certainly counted, it engenders a tremendous ambition to do something that will be historically important for Japan. Soseki is said at an early age to have considered things such as architecture, and someone is supposed to have said to him, there's no point in thinking that in Japan you'll create something like St. Paul's Cathedral, because with our earthquakes it would just fall down. So there's a pressure on Soseki and his generation to do something equally great, but that might be in a slightly different realm. And this means that Soseki was drawn towards literature, first of all mastering the English language, absorbing Western literature, and particularly English literature, and then beginning to think about how we could raise literature up to the same levels of Western literature. And this was an age where Japan has tremendously ancient and rich traditions of literature. But what we get in the Meiji period at the end of the 19th century is that literature, there's a new conception of literature as something which is important to national prestige in a way that it hadn't been conceived before. Then this itself will help Japan rise up and be the equal of any nation in the world. And Soseki begins to feel that great burden on his shoulders.
Well, as a young man, Soseki moved to the provinces and was pursuing a fairly quiet life as a teacher. But then in 1900, an opportunity came up that would turn his life on its head. He was summoned by the Japanese government to go to London to study English literature. And Damian, tell us more about his experiences in the United Kingdom, because it was a difficult period for him, wasn't it?
Well, Soseki was fairly reluctant to go because the timing was a little bit late for him. He's already into his 30s, he's married, he's got a child, he's got another child on the way. But he also realised that through going to England, this might be a stepping stone to get a plum educational position at one of the important educational institutions in Japan when he comes back. He eventually achieved this and became a lecturer at the University of Tokyo. But coming to England, a place with a very high cost of living, he was given quite a small stipend by the Japanese government. And he feels that he's given 2 years in which the Japanese government were really most interested in mastering English. But as someone who had been steeped in English literature, Soseki really took it upon himself that he wanted to achieve something great in a literary sense as well. So he switches to a fairly radical course of action. He buys about 400 to 500 secondhand books. He thinks that he would like to sit down and pen a revolutionary new theory of literature, and to consider this from every single angle. So he's reading books on sociology, science, history, fine art, lots of current theories. But the idea is so overwhelming that this ends up, and he becomes so secluded in his boarding house world in London that his mental health starts to falter.
I wanted to ask about that because it's right, isn't it, Reiko, that this life overseas caused considerable mental strain on him and that the Ministry of Education even doubted his sanity.
Yes, right. And I think it had a lot to do with culture shock, the shock of encountering both English literature and English people in real life, but, which he felt had turned out to be very different from what he had ever imagined. And especially sort of meeting independent English women who can go ride bicycles that he couldn't ride. And there is this sort of humiliating episode about how he struggled to learn to ride a bicycle on a woman's bicycle because he was short. And it was an extremely humiliating and almost traumatic experience for him. And I guess it maybe taught him that there is this gap between knowledge and experience, that even if you think you know a lot about a given culture or, ideas, experiencing it in real life is very different.
So, Michael, by the time he returned to Japan, how did these experiences in London help shape him?
Well, the first thing that happens when he comes back to Japan is he's able to return to Tokyo, which, as Damian said, had been his goal for quite some time. And he receives a teaching position at the university and at other institutions in Tokyo. And he starts trying to put together the ideas and the notes from his readings into this grand theory and deliver them as lectures to his students at the university. As he, over the course of 2 years, refined his ideas and repeated the lectures, the ideas started to come together, and he started at this point to experiment with writing fictions. And so it's in 1905, 1906 that we start having his first publications like Kusumakura, I Am a Cat, and other early stories. And he starts, as he moves away from his attempt to produce a scientific theory of literature, he moves into the practice of literature and starts to achieve real success in that field.
Well, he was a late bloomer compared to other writers. He didn't start writing creatively until the age of 37 in 1904. And his first novel, I Am a Cat, was initially published in serialized form in 1905. More novels followed over the next 10 years until his early death in 1916. Reiko, many Japanese students first encounter Soseki in high school, don't they? Was that your experience? And were you drawn to his work?
Well, actually, Kokoro is one of the most sort of canonical high school novel. Every high school student in Japan, at least at the time I was a high school student, had to read Kokoro, but I didn't really like it very much. It was probably because I knew that we were expected to appreciate it in a certain way. Kokoro was like a sacred text that was supposed to teach you a moral lesson about how not to be egotistical, how not to betray your friend. Kokoro is a novel about this protagonist called the Sensei, who ends up betraying his best friend. They fall in love with the same woman, and Sensei proposes marriage to this woman without behind his friend's back, and which he regrets very much later. His friend commits a suicide, and then in the end, Sensei too commits a suicide, regretting that he has betrayed his friend. My reaction was that it was all about male friendship and male loyalty, and the Ojo-san, the woman they both fell in love with. There was a lot of talk about love for this woman, but there is very little concern about her feelings, her opinions, what she really wanted. And Sensei marries this woman, Ojo-san, later, and this wife suspects that Sensei is hiding something because she noticed that he has his personality has changed. And but she doesn't know anything about his betrayal, and she doesn't know, the wife doesn't know why he has committed suicide. And she begs Sensei to open up and tell her what has actually happened, which Sensei refuses. So this is very much about a sort of male relationship, a friendship between Sensei and the friend that he has betrayed and committed a suicide, without telling his wife anything at all. And in the end, Sensei famously writes this testament and a letter, leaving it to his young male protege, and telling him never to tell his wife what was behind his death, nor his friend's death.
So it's interesting that you say the novel's mostly about male relationships, because reading it, I was certainly struck by how few women appear in the text and how little explored they are as characters. Here's the narrator's first impressions of Sensei's wife.
Like any other young man, I was not indifferent to women. But being young, and my experience of the world being what it was, I had so far had no opportunity to form any friendship with a woman. My interest in women had been limited to glances thrown at those who were completely unknown to me. The first time I met Sensei's wife in the front hall, I thought her beautiful, and each time I saw her after that, I was similarly impressed by her beauty. But I felt at first that there was nothing of any interest that I could speak to her about.
Reiko, do you think this represented Soseki's approach to gender, or is that simply the naive perspective of this character?
Oh, I think it's very much representative in a way of Soseki's ambivalent approach to gender. On the one hand, he believes in sort of equality, gender equality, and he thinks women should be respected as independent people. But emotionally speaking, it's very difficult for him probably to treat his wife as an independent person, something that he gives expression to in his autobiographical novel called Grass on the Wayside. So I think it is kind of symptomatic, again, of the kind of conflict many young men in the Meiji period were faced with, the conflict between the traditional Confucian homosocial value system with women in the background and the new European sort of Western principle of heterosexual love premised on gender equality, which was still a very new idea in the Meiji period. And Soseki and his cohorts in the Meiji period read a lot of Western literature, of course, and knew about this intellectually, but emotionally they grew up in a completely different era. So there is this gap again between what they have learned at school and how they grew up.
Obviously, all the extracts that we're hearing here are in translation, but Soseki is loved and admired for his linguistic virtuosity. So, Michael, can you give us a sense of his skill with language?
He's oftentimes a very difficult writer to translate because he uses the resources of the Japanese language in often quite brilliant ways. One of the things that he's quite noted for is using Chinese characters in creative ways. So he will give a word written in Chinese characters and then in a superscript pronunciation guide above it, assign a different word, a different pronunciation to the word than the standard pronunciation, so that we end up with two different meanings combined in a single word. The other thing that he's really brilliant at, and this comes out especially in his earlier fiction like Kusamakura, is an ability to move quite fluidly back and forth between quite different writing styles, classical Japanese literary writing styles associated with haiku, classical Chinese poetry, and he also quotes a lot of English poetry and Western literary works. And so there's this fluid ability to move back and forth between very different literary styles, all in the context of a single work, to produce really brilliant literary effects that as a translator, they oftentimes have you pulling your hair out because it's very hard to reproduce them in English.
Natsume Soseki also had a remarkable influence on other writers and artists, and way beyond Japan too. Damian, tell us a bit more about Soseki's writing and how it came to influence the renowned Canadian pianist Glenn Gould.
Well, I think it's a really fascinating story how Glenn Gould came into contact with Soseki. Soseki has had influences on other major literary figures in Asia, such as the great Chinese writer Lu Xun, for example, who was living in Japan at the time that Soseki was publishing, used to read his writings in newspapers and subsequently translated some of his works into Chinese. And Soseki's also had a great influence on the contemporary bestseller Haruki Murakami. But what's fascinating about Glenn Gould is Gould, as a pianist, had no particular interest in Japan whatsoever, and no connection, certainly, to anything like Japanese literature, and was in the mid-60s, Gould had pretty much retired from concert performing, was living a fairly reclusive lifestyle. But during his summer holidays, when he was travelling up to the north of Canada, he happened to be approached by a chemistry professor on a train who plucked up the courage to engage this slightly forbidding figure in conversation, and told him about a book that had recently been translated into English, The Three-Cornered World, Kusamakura, and said that he thought that Gould might enjoy it. And after that meeting, he sent the book to Gould. This book had an absolutely transformative impact on Gould, who previously Gould's favourite book had been Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. But Gould subsequently completely swapped to The Three-Cornered World. It clearly spoke to Gould's ideas about what art might be, an incredibly powerful sense. Gould, with his interpretations of music, was looking for a kind of level of serenity that he really felt struck a chord with what Soseki was talking about in The Three-Cornered World. Subsequently, Gould bought up every copy of Soseki he could get his hands on. He was planning on turning The Three-Cornered World into a play called Shioda's Daughter when he died 15 years later. And Gould had a radio show in Canada in which he spent the entire show reading out the first chapter of this novel to his listeners. And it's famously said that when Glenn Gould died, on his bedside table were discovered just two books, the Bible and The Three-Cornered World.
Soseki was obviously hugely influential in Japan and indeed across Asia and beyond. So, given his significance, why do you think, Reiko, apart from Glenn Gould, he remains so little known in the West?
Soseki's characters are not very outspoken. They are taciturn, especially women. They don't say very much at all. And the reader is, in a way, invited to read between the lines all the time, which might be difficult if you don't know the historical context of the novel, like the sort of gendered hierarchy in the family system I talked about earlier. And, the glances and the gestures, demeanors, all these things count a lot because they don't say very much. And I have always wondered if that might have something to do with it.
Damian, it's interesting, though, isn't it, that here is a Japanese writer who spent some considerable time in London, so it's odd that he didn't have a major profile in the English-speaking world, in a way, isn't it?
I think a major part of it is timing. So obviously, while Soseki was alive, Japanese books were not being translated into English. You don't really start to get Japanese classics translated into English. Really, on the 1950s is when the stream really starts. You have some things before the war, like Arthur Waley's translation of The Tale of Genji, a classic text. But it's only really in the 1950s that more modern Japanese novels start to be translated into English. And at that point, what people were really looking for were contemporary Japanese voices. So Yukio Mishima becomes the first Japanese author to really gain a sort of popularity in the West during the late 50s and early 1960s. At that point, Soseki too also starts to be translated into English. But unfortunately, this is translations that were then of books that were already 40, 50 years old. So they're harking back to what seems like an Edwardian period in the British sense of it. I think the other problem is when people encounter Soseki, they don't really encounter a lot of the superficial stereotypes that people tend to be looking for in so-called Japanese literature. So the sense of stories of samurai and geisha and the type of thing that gained ready acceptance and that people looked for when they read Japanese novels in the 1960s and 70s. Because Soseki was so profoundly steeped in English literature, and I think there's a very strong strain of English irony that runs through all his writings, he stands slightly at odds with the Japanese literary tradition, despite the fact that paradoxically he stands at the top of that literary tradition. But it meant that readers in the West found him a slightly slippery character to get a hold of. And I think that even now, both in Japan and the West, there's a difficulty in actually grasping exactly what Soseki's writing style is, because I think he's a supreme master of irony. And I personally, just picking up on some of the other things that were said, I think that in no way should you conflate narrative voices in Soseki with Soseki's own ideas of things. I think again and again, Soseki is ironically undercutting a lot of these characters. And even in Japan, I think that is something that has been consistently misunderstood over the decades.
Michael, do you want to comment here? Is this the thing, that he's too complex, too subtle, too slippery, as Damian put it, for Western readers who were expecting some kind of Japanese stereotype?
I think that explains a lot of the delay in the introduction of Soseki, and there's also the question of personal taste. The first great translators of Japanese literature into English didn't like Soseki very much. They had stylistic preference for other kinds of writers. But the difficulties of translating him, the fact that he does not appeal to a certain desire for exoticism, the way that writers like Mishima or Tanizaki or Kawabata appealed for, all made him a kind of a hard sell in the 1960s and 70s. But I think as someone who spent the last 30 or 40 years very much in love with Soseki, the last decade or so has been a wonderful time, because we're seeing a flood of new translations, and it feels like finally Soseki is being made available to readers in the English-speaking world.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask Reiko about that. Reiko, he's today a venerated figure in Japan, of course. Someone's even created an Android version of him, haven't they? And can you explain a bit more about how he maintains his relevance today, and especially in modern-day Japan?
In Japan and not in the West. I think, like many of the things Soseki problematized in his novels has to do with how to live through the time of great changes and transformation. The Meiji period was such a period for obvious reasons, but right after the war, there was this great transformation. And in a way, we are all sort of living through the time of changes all the time. And these changes are difficult in the sense that how they are sort of, how people catch up with the changes are very uneven, which creates difficulties. So in that sense, many of the characters, the struggles that the characters in Kokoro, in Soseki's literature are going through are probably relevant in that sense.
Well, that's a good point to end, where we can learn from Soseki in our own troubled and turbulent times. And I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. My thanks to my guests, Reiko Abe Auestad, Michael Bourdaghs and Damian Flanagan. The reader was Dai Tabuchi, and the extracts were translated by Edwin McClellan and Alan Turney. I'm Bridget Kendall, and thank you for listening.